So welcome to this Meet the Expert session on PCI DSS version 4. I'm hosting today and I'm Richard Ford, the CTO for Integrity 360. And I'll hand you over to Martin and Alessandro in a second to introduce themselves. But in this session, we're going to look in depth at PCI version 4 and really what's different, what organizations need to be aware of and need to be thinking about as they approach it with the due date for it to be implemented coming up very soon. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Martin and Alessandro for them to introduce themselves. Martin?
Thank you, Richard. My name is Martin Petrov, and I've been in the PCI industry since 2004, and version 1 of the standard was released in 2005. I maintain an active QSA status, and today I represent Integrity 360 at the PCI Council's GEAR Committee. I've been through all the changes in the standard, and I'd like to think I can talk about a few changes that are coming up as well.
Brilliant. Alessandro?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Richard. I'm Alessandro Malfitano, and I am the practice manager of the Payment Compliance Department and still a QSA and an SSF assessor.
So Martin, let's start with you. When we're talking about PCI DSS version 4, what are some of the notable changes that organizations need to bear in mind?
Sure. I would describe it as a much bigger and more complex assessment and reporting as one notable item. Then I would also suggest that the addition of 64 new requirements, of which 51 are future dated, is a notable increase because that represents 25% more requirements. And also, I would note that future dated requirements typically suggest that they're either more complex and or more costly. Last but not least, I would note items noted for improvement. This is something that came off of the back of compliant with remediation status. That status has now been retired.
And Alessandro, what's your view on some of the important changes in PCI DSS version 4?
Yeah, I will adjust a couple of other important changes related to the version 4 of the PCI DSS standard. The first one is the customized approach versus the classic defined approach, which to be adopted require a certain level of maturity in risk assessment practice by the assessed entity, probably not hugely impacting, but certainly bringing complexity to the mix. On this, I'd like to point out that compensating controls are here to stay. And the second one is the targeted risk analysis, which is a new approach to risk assessments that has been introduced in this standard.
Interesting. So let's dive down into each one of these points in a bit more detail. And Martin, I think we'll start with yourself and your very first point there around the size and complexity. So what do you mean by being bigger and more complex?
Sure. There's a couple of dimensions that we can look at. So by way of example, the standard itself, the document which contained version 3.2.1, was a total of 139 pages. Version 4 on the other side is 360. This is more than double the amount. Likewise, if we compare the report on compliance template, which was previously 192 pages, is now 492 in version 4. This is 250% increase. Another example is the so-called 64 new requirements, which represent a 25% increase overall. Previously, there were 258, and now we have 322. This is the quantitative side of things. Qualitatively looking, the complexity has increased because we have a wider scope of technologies which are required to be implemented. And the level of detail which the implementation is described is very high. Take, for example, the use of hashing algorithms or page script integrity monitoring. It must be noted also that reporting has become more cumbersome and more complex. A large portion in version 4 is now shifted as a responsibility to the assessed entity, and that also includes the INFI. Now is a good time to say wow.
Yeah, and indeed, and also to start talking about INFI as well. Yeah, so what are the items noted for improvement and how do they impact compliance?
Sure. So INFI came on the back of a newly introduced compliance status called compliant with remediation. It was published in the first release of version 4, which came out in March 2022, I believe. That status was retired in December 2022 release of the standard. And this release is now referred to as revision 1. So INFI came to replace compliant with remediation, and it had identical goal and intent, which was to inform the management of the organization being assessed about the deficiencies, the gaps, the non-compliances that were identified during the assessment. So why did INFI come to life and why did it replace compliant with remediation status? Well, compliant with remediation status was included in the report on compliance and in the attestation of compliance. And in particular, the attestation of compliance is a public document, and essentially it created a record that there was a point in time or a period of time when the organization wasn't compliant, essentially creating problems from an insurance perspective or from a contract perspective. That is why it was retired. Now, the goal ultimately is to highlight non-compliant areas which very often have a repetitive nature, and it would help the management of an organization to provide the necessary focus and resources to remediate those and ensure that there is no security breaches resulting in data compromise.
Thanks, Martin. That's great. And Alessandro, I know that you want to have your say on INFI as well. So what's your view of the impact that it has?
Well, Richard, I would like to add that there is also another reason why the compliant with the remediation answer was removed. Naturally, one of the fundamental problems of this approach is that it also gives opportunity to abuse it and to adopt it as a possible common practice. Therefore, it allowed a recovery of non-conformity short before or even during the assessment, and not to be constantly compliant during the whole year. That is in true what the standard pursues.
And keep with yourself, Alessandro. You talked about the new customized approach. So can you kind of talk me through, well, how does that differ from the defined approach that was used previously?
Well, the intent of a customized approach is to give organizations that are mature in their information security risk management and also possess advanced technology stacks a more flexible way of meeting the intent of the security requirements in the standard, especially in cases where technology implemented are ahead of the wording in the standard, and following them verbatim could literally mean going backward, and this is understandable as the standard is fairly static for 5 or more years for each major version, while technology often moves with leaps and bounds. For example, let's think about the rapid evolution of AI. We cannot predict how it will help satisfy some security controls in a couple of years. Here, it is also critical to note that this does not mean that customized approach is cheaper or easier, but often is the opposite. So while the term customized approach is new kid of the block, what we are used to was termed defined approach that we might also call classic approach. What is very useful to know is that the two approaches, classic and customized, can be mixed, given that they can be applied to an individual requirement level and to an individual asset level as well. And the old compensation controls are also here to stay. I doubt that the majority of organizations will apply this new customized approach to more than 3 or 4 requirements in one assessment, similar to how often compensating control were used. And Richard, there is much more to say about the customized approach, but it requires a dedicated session just for it.
Well, I look forward to that session at some point in the future, Alessandro. We can go through that in detail. The other point you made or called out for sort of changes in version 4 that organizations need to be aware of is the targeted risk analysis. So can you expand on targeted risk analysis, what it is and why this is a significant change to the standard?
Sure. In PCI DSS version 4, certain requirements allow entities to customize their frequency of activity or the robustness of controls based on environmental risks. This target risk analysis focuses on specific risks, offering flexibility in the frequency of some controls execution. So, for some requirement, entity can evaluate and establish the frequency that ensure adequate security and align with the risk tolerance. Examples include the determination of time frame to install some security patch, to review access privilege, and to establish password change periods. Targeted risk analyses are more flexible and outcome-driven than the traditional organization-wide risk assessment required in the requirement 12 of the previous version of the standard. Broadly, there are 2 scenarios which call on the use of targeted risk analysis. The first scenario is when customized approach is used during an assessment to a particular requirement or set of requirements in technologically advanced and risk-mature organization, as mentioned earlier. The other scenario is for all periodic PCI requirements where no specific frequency of robustness is defined. There are currently 9 such requirements in version 4 that mandate targeted risk analysis to determine activity frequency and robustness. They focus on elements such as asset classification, threat assessment, potential impact and likelihood of an adverse events to justify the chosen frequency.
Brilliant. So that's some of the changes, some of the ways that we approach PCI DSS version 4. Let's dive into some of those new controls. Now, there's 64 new controls, 51 which were future dated that you talked about, Martin. If we think about these future dated requirements, what should companies be most aware of when it comes to these?
It would be hard to take the time now for all of them. One of my favorite ones, though, is the authenticated scans requirement, which on its own can take a whole session. Essentially, authenticated scans differ from the historic scans, which are essentially unauthenticated, in that the scanning solution now logs into the target system with administrative credentials, and it is able to perform a far deeper analysis. Of course, the benefit and the result of this is that it can provide a far more accurate and comprehensive picture of vulnerabilities which previously were not detectable in the classic way, such as privilege escalation. It can also report on various compliance standards. It can inspect what are the password settings and report whether they are aligned or not with requirements, or detect outdated software components. The downside is that it will typically take much more bandwidth. It will impact the network, and in some cases, it could even break things. There is also an inherent risk when transporting and configuring the administrative credentials into the scanning solution that they are intercepted or exposed. Ultimately, the authenticated scans will present a picture which was previously not known or experienced, far more detailed, and that will result in more work for those system administrators taking care of the systems, but on the upside, it will provide a much higher degree of assurance and compliance and security.
Very good. And Martin's talked through his favorite of the new 51 future dated requirements. Alessandro, if I can come to yourself, and if we're talking about favorites, what would you call out as your favorite of the new controls?
Yeah, there are some new requirements that specifically address certain attack scenarios. As criminals continue to shift their effort to the lowest hanging fruit, due to the fact that other area of the PCI DSS environment has been secured, we have seen in recent years an increased activity around attacking the payment page. This has called for the need of a new breed of defense technique and technology, which are rapidly evolving, with more and more vendors offering solutions which require high levels of technical expertise. So what we are talking about? Modern payment pages are loaded with all kinds of script in order to enhance their functionality and data gathering capability. Additionally, complex web page consists of multiple objectives, often assembled from multiple internet locations, making it harder to detect any discrepancies and unauthorized change. This presents multiple attack vectors for cybercriminals, such as e-commerce skimming attack, also known as form-jacking or megacart attack, which enable criminals to exfiltrate cardholder data transparently and unknowingly to all parties involved, even without interrupting the regular transaction flow, thus remaining undetected for extended period of times, sometimes also years. There are two new future data requirements, namely 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, which specially target the monitoring and maintenance of the integrity of the payment page scripts and HTTP headers. Should any unauthorized change occur to any of those, the organization's incident response plan has to be triggered with all relevant steps, which include investigation, containment, and for sure lesson learned.
And Martin, so given the significant changes that are on the horizon when it comes to PCI DSS version 4, what is the most critical action companies should take right now in preparation?
Well, there are several, but what I would define as critical is to engage with a knowledgeable, experienced, and reputable QSA company such as ours that not only understands the intricate details of PCI DSS version 4, but also how to apply them practically and effectively. I think starting early with the expert guidance will make this transition much more manageable and will position companies to not just comply, but to lead in their security efforts. What I would like to say in conclusion is that all of those changes cumulatively underscore the journey towards compliance as an ongoing process, not just a destination. It also means that organizations must continually monitor, adjust, and report on their security posture in an ever-evolving threat landscape. This is where I believe that our team of experts can provide the utmost value.
And Alessandro, your view on what organizations need to be doing now?
You know, Richard, as it goes that to take a step forward, you need to understand where you are. And we believe that doing a PCI DSS 4.0 gap assessment allows entities to know where they are in PCI DSS terms. Most certainly, I can add that in light of the increased technical depth and brief of the PCI DSS version 4.0, another key action for company that should be considered is outsourcing the not core activity to specialized service provider, such as security operation centers and managed security service provider. This approach allows organizations to benefit from high-level security expertise without the need to develop this capability in-house, which can be both cost prohibitive and outside the core competencies of the entities. It's a strategic move to stay ahead in compliance and security without diverting focus from their essential business functions. Our role as QSA include helping to select the right service provider and to ensure that their services align properly with the PCI DSS 4.0 requirement, but also with specific needs of the business.
And excellent. So that concludes our Meet the Experts session on PCI DSS version 4 and the changes and what we need to start thinking about to prepare for that. If you have any more further questions or would like any more details, please reach out to the team, as Alessandro and Martin and our QSA team are there to assist. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.